Imagine waking up to a beautiful sunrise, unaware that deadly radiation is falling from the sky. No alarms, no warnings, just silence. In 1957, that's exactly what happened. Not by accident, but by design. Chapter 1, a test with no warning. It was just after dawn on May 5, 1957. To the untrained eye, it looked like a peaceful morning. But 1,500 feet above the ground, something massive was about to change everything. It was part of Operation Plumbob, a series of nuclear tests conducted that year at the Nevada test site. The bomb released the largest amount of radiation of any above-ground test in U.S. history. It was powerful, more than 4 times the size of the one dropped on Hiroshima. The sky over the Nevada desert was clear, calm, and eerily still. At 5:35 a.m., the U.S. government detonated a nuclear device known as shothood. But here's the most disturbing part. The government didn't warn the people who live nearby. They had no idea what had just happened. No sirens, no alerts. America had entered the nuclear age, and it was rushing to test, perfect, and expand its arsenal. Officials believed the desert was safe, isolated enough to contain the explosions. Nothing but the distant rumble of thunder that wasn't thunder at all. Thousands of American citizens, farmers, children, teachers, churchgoers were going about their normal lives just miles from the blast. Cattle became sick. Some pets died suddenly, but no one knew why. The government kept quiet, and what came next was invisible. Internal memos showed that the government was aware of the exposure risks, but they pressed forward. More tests followed, -29 in total during Operation Plumbob. Shothood was just the beginning. By keeping things quiet, they thought they could avoid responsibility. If something was wrong, surely someone would say something. But no one did. The Nevada test site was created in 1951, just 6 years after the end of World War II. Winds pushed it east, across Utah, Idaho, and beyond. The cloud passed over towns like St. George, Cedar City, and even parts of northern Arizona. But they weren't just testing bombs. They were watching how far the radiation would spread, and that's where ordinary people unknowingly became part of the experiment. The real-world consequences would unfold across the western United States. How it moved through water, how it entered the food chain, how it affected livestock, and, though rarely admitted, how it impacted human health. On the day of shothood, the fallout cloud didn't stay in the desert. In fact, many of them were exposed to hundreds of times the amount considered safe. Today, people in those towns woke up, made breakfast, went to school, children played outside, farmers worked their fields, mothers hung clothes on the line, all while radioactive particles rained silently from the sky. It all looks safe, but we now know those same fields were laced with radioactive iodine and the milk in the local grocery store was contaminated. We'll look at the painful aftermath, the quiet cover-ups, and the rare moments when survivors tried to speak out. The air they breathed carried microscopic killers. In the weeks after the test, strange things began to happen. People reported burning eyes, skin rashes, and metallic tastes in their mouths. Shothood was part of a pattern. Year after year, tests continued. Each one sent radioactive clouds drifting over civilian towns, sometimes without the towns even realizing it. At the time, most Americans trusted their leaders behind closed doors. However, scientists were already documenting the fallout patterns. So why didn't they warn anyone? According to documents later declassified, the government believed that telling people might cause public panic. They also worried about lawsuits. But there was another reason. They were collecting data. Shothood wasn't just a weapons test. It was also a chance to study how radiation affected real communities. In effect, the test site extended beyond Nevada. What makes this story so haunting is how ordinary everything looked on the surface. If you look at photos from that time, you'll see smiling children riding bikes, young couples at picnics, farmers tending to fields. And it wasn't just a one-time event. The people affected would come to be known as Downwinders, ordinary Americans who lived downwind of the test site and were exposed without their knowledge or consent. The official story at the time was simple. The tests are safe. Radiation levels are low. No one is in danger. But the truth as we now know, was far more complicated. A 1997 government report admitted that some people near the test site received radiation doses far beyond safe limits. The same report concluded that the government could have and should have taken stronger steps to warn and protect civilians, but they didn't. And by the time the truth began to emerge, it was already too late for many. As we move forward in this story, we'll learn about what that fallout really did, how it affected people's bodies, their families, and their communities. But for now, think about this. A test that was never announced, a cloud no one could see, and a country that chose silence. Chapter 2, The Fallout. They tried to forget the day after Shot Hood. Life went on like nothing had happened. Children walked to school under clear blue skies. Farmers opened their barns. People went to church. No one knew they had just been exposed to something invisible, something that would follow them for the rest of their lives. In St. George, Utah, about 135 miles downwind from the Nevada test site, there were no warnings, no sirens, not even a newspaper headline. But radioactive particles had already reached their town, and they didn't stop there. It settled in valleys, on rooftops, in gardens, and inside people's homes. It clung to clothes, it entered lungs, it fell onto grazing fields where cattle fed, and it landed in open water tanks used for drinking. The fallout from Shot Hood traveled hundreds of miles across the western United States. At first, there were no visible signs. Nothing seemed wrong. But within weeks, animals began getting sick. Sheep in nearby areas lost patches of wool. Some stopped walking. Calves were born with deformities. Chickens died suddenly. Farmers knew something was off, but they couldn't prove anything. Then people started getting sick too. Some described a strange metallic taste in their mouths. Others felt burning sensations on their skin. A few experienced sudden nausea, dizziness, and headaches. Many developed swollen thyroid glands. Some were diagnosed with thyroid cancer before they turned 10. Others had immune issues, mysterious growths, or stunted development. Now I wonder if every drop of water carried something deadly. Mild food poisoning, nothing to worry about. But they didn't connect these symptoms to the explosion, because no one had told them about the test. Doctors were puzzled. They gave generic diagnoses. It's probably the flu. But the symptoms kept coming, and they kept getting worse. A school teacher lost her voice permanently after developing throat cancer. A young couple had 5 miscarriages in a row. A man who never smoked developed lung cancer in his 30s, as did his brother. Some children were born missing limbs. Others were blind. Some never lived past infancy. Months turned into years. There's no solid proof. Radiation levels were too low to cause harm, and slowly, the deeper effects of the fallout began to show. Children were the first to suffer. In one family near Enterprise, Utah, all 3 children were diagnosed with different forms of cancer before reaching adulthood. One mother told reporters years later, "My kids used to play in the sprinklers in the backyard. We thought it was harmless fun." A few brave doctors documented the patterns they were seeing in local patients. Scientists raised alarms, but still, the government held its line. The tests were safe. These chemicals don't just disappear. They settle in bones, in thyroid glands, in unborn babies. They can stay in the body for decades, slowly doing damage. Radiation maps showed contamination reaching parts of Colorado, Nebraska, and even the Midwest. Thyroid cancer rates in southern Utah spiked, especially in women and children. Leukemia cases rose. Autoimmune diseases became more common. Shared stories, filed lawsuits. It exposed footage of nuclear tests and the impact they had on both soldiers and civilians. Most people got nothing. No money, no apology. The government demanded medical records. It shocked the public and finally pushed some officials to take a second look. In some cases, all they had were memories and death certificates. And yet, officials denied a link to the nuclear tests. It was a rare moment of official acknowledgement. Some downwinders received payments of $50,000 or more. The most heartbreaking part, these were not isolated cases. Their stories live on in newspaper clippings, taped interviews, and graveyards that are far too full for towns so small. Entire neighborhoods seemed cursed, and it wasn't just cancer. Studies would later show elevated rates of birth defects, miscarriages, and developmental disorders in areas downwind of the test site. Still, the government kept quiet. When residents started asking questions, they were told it was all coincidence, but people knew something was wrong. You don't need a PhD to notice when everyone on your street starts dying young. Eventually, word started to spread. Journalists began digging. In 1980, a documentary aired on national television called The Atomic. That's when the truth started to come out. Government reports, many of them previously classified, confirmed that fallout from tests like shot had drifted far beyond expected zones. One internal report admitted that under certain weather conditions, exposure may have exceeded safety thresholds for some populations. That was putting it mildly. In reality, many people had been exposed to dangerously high levels of radioactive iodine. By the time the government acknowledged any of this, thousands had already died. Some survivors tried to fight back. They formed groups, but proving a direct link between fallout and illness was difficult. How do you prove that the thing that killed you came from the sky? Out of more than 2,000 claims filed in the 1980s, only a few hundred were accepted. In 1990, after years of pressure, Congress passed the Radiation Exposure Compensation Act, but many found the process cold and bureaucratic. Families had to prove exposure, often decades after the fact. One man said, "They poisoned my family and then asked me to fill out a form." That's not justice. The compensation helped, but it didn't erase the pain. Today, many downwinders are gone. What they experienced was not just physical destruction, it was betrayal. They trusted their government. They believed they were safe, and for that trust, many of them paid with their lives. Chapter 3. Was it really an accident? By now, you might be wondering the same thing many survivors asked themselves for decades. How could this have been allowed to happen? How could so many people be exposed to radioactive fallout without a single warning? Was it really just a mistake? At first glance, it sounds like it might have been. Shot was part of a massive testing program. The science of nuclear fallout wasn't fully understood yet. The wind shifted. The radiation drifted farther than expected. That's the official version. But when you look closer at the memos, the maps, the decisions made behind closed doors, that version starts to fall apart. They even had a name for this risk: downwind contamination. Because the truth is, they knew more than they said. And in some cases, they knew exactly what would happen. Let's go back to Operation Plumber, the series of nuclear tests that included shot hood. Declassified documents show that before the test even began, scientists and military planners knew the winds were unpredictable. One internal Air Force memo from 1957 stated, "There is a high probability that radioactive particles may drift over civilian populations, depending on wind behavior." And yet, the test went forward. Why? Because they wanted to observe what would happen. That same memo continued. These events may provide an opportunity for real-time monitoring of human and ecological exposure under uncontrolled conditions. They wanted to study the effects, not just on the environment, but on real people. In other words, the fallout wasn't just a byproduct, it was part of the experiment. This isn't a conspiracy theory. It's all in the paperwork, buried for decades, then declassified slowly over time. There were whistleblowers, doctors, researchers, even military officers who raised concerns. One report from the Atomic Energy Commission included plans to track the movement of radioactive clouds using weather balloons, ground sensors, and even local hospitals. In another case, officials placed air monitors in towns downwind, not to warn the residents, but to measure how much radiation they were breathing. He later testified before Congress that many of the health studies were manipulated to avoid showing the full truth. These decisions were deliberate. They didn't see the people in these towns as victims. It was a test of both the wind and public silence. They saw them as data points. Let's be clear, not every scientist involved supported this. Dr. Alice Stewart, a British epidemiologist, warned the US government in the 1950s that even small doses of radiation could be deadly over time, especially for children. They had access to studies going back to the aftermath of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. They saw what nuclear fallout could do. Her warnings were dismissed. Later, Dr. John Goffman, a physicist who worked directly with the AE, left the program after discovering how much data was being ignored, or worse, hidden. And then there's the now famous Green Run case. In 1949, years before Shothood, the US secretly released radioactive iodine over parts of Washington state to study how it spread. That experiment, like many others, was kept secret for over 40 years. So what does this all mean? In it, a military official described the importance of continuing tests, regardless of civilian interference. It means that the suffering of the Downwinders wasn't just the result of bad planning, it was the result of calculated risk, a risk taken without consent and without transparency. Officials knew that radiation exposure could cause cancer, birth defects, and long-term illness, but they believed the greater good of developing nuclear weapons outweighed the potential harm to a few thousand civilians, and so they moved forward. There's one document that haunts many researchers even today. It's a memo written just weeks before Shothood. Let that sink in. Civilians weren't just an afterthought. They were an obstacle to be ignored. And once the test was complete and the fallout began to spread, the priority wasn't to warn or evacuate. It was to protect the program. When survivors and journalists started asking questions in the 1980s, government spokespeople stuck to a script. The compensation program came decades later, and only after relentless pressure. We didn't fully understand the science at the time. We believed the doses were safe. We followed the best information available, but that wasn't true. The fear of Soviet advancement, the fear that America would be caught off guard in a future war. A 1994 report from the U.S. General Accounting Office revealed that government officials had multiple opportunities to halt or delay tests due to wind conditions, but rarely did so. Even worse, some officials pressured scientists to change their findings to make the numbers look less alarming. The goal wasn't public safety. The goal was plausible deniability. And what about justice? Very little came of it. No one was held personally responsible. No trials. No formal investigations with consequences. For most families, the damage was already done. They had buried loved ones, lost entire generations, and lived with the quiet knowledge that their government had lied to them. It's important to say this again. Not all of this was done out of evil. Some of it came from fear. The fear of falling behind in the arms race. But fear doesn't erase the facts. And the fact is this. The government knew people would be harmed, and they chose to move forward anyway. So was it really an accident? No, it was a choice. A quiet, calculated choice made by people in power behind closed doors, far from the towns that would suffer the consequences. Chapter 4. The victims who fought back. By the time the truth began to surface in the 1980s, many of the people affected by America's nuclear testing were already gone. Cancer had taken them. Illness had worn them down. Some never knew what hit them, but those who remained, the survivors, the families, the neighbors, started to speak. They called themselves down. The name was simple but powerful. It said everything. They were the ones who lived downwind, the ones who didn't volunteer to be part of any experiment, the ones who weren't warned, protected, or even acknowledged. But they weren't going to stay silent anymore. She had lost her husband to leukemia and her daughter to bone cancer, both within 5 years. At first, she believed it was just cruel coincidence. Babies were born with defects that no doctor could explain. She started keeping track in a notebook. One of the first to speak out was a woman named Clara Bickford, a school teacher from St. George, Utah. She contacted journalists. She spoke at town meetings. She told anyone who would listen. Then she noticed something strange. Small support groups formed. They shared photos, timelines, medical records, anything they could gather. Other families on her block had similar stories. Neighbors died of rare cancers. Children were diagnosed with thyroid disease. Within a year, she had written down 57 names, just from her neighborhood. She went public. We were used, and we deserved the truth. Clara wasn't alone. All across Utah, Arizona, Nevada, and parts of Idaho, people started coming together. They wanted answers. And more than that, they wanted justice. How do you prove that your childless cancer came from a radioactive cloud that passed by 20 years ago? How do you prove something invisible? He said. But it wasn't easy. The government denied any wrongdoing. Officials repeated the same line. There is no proven link between nuclear tests and civilian illnesses, but the Downwinders kept pushing. Documentaries, articles, and investigative reports started to appear. Stories of tragedy, loss, and betrayal. Names, faces, numbers that couldn't be ignored anymore. In 1981, a group of them filed a lawsuit against the United States government. It was a long shot, almost unheard of at the time. They weren't suing for money. They were suing for recognition. They wanted someone to admit, officially, that this had happened. The case dragged on for years. Government lawyers demanded documentation that most families didn't have. One man, David Hunsaker, lost 3 siblings to cancer. He brought stacks of their medical records to court. If this doesn't count as evidence, then what does? But in the end, the case was dismissed. The judge ruled that the government was immune due to national security protections. No one was held responsible. That didn't stop they turned to the press. One 1985 report found that St. George had one of the highest thyroid cancer rates in the entire country, despite having a population of just a few thousand people. Another uncovered that officials had monitored fallout levels in milk, yet never warned families who drank it daily. Public pressure started to build, and in 1990, something remarkable happened. Some are pushing to expand RECA to include more counties, more illnesses, and longer time windows. Congress passed the Radiation Exposure Compensation Act. For the first time, the U.S. government officially recognized that its nuclear testing had harmed civilians. The act offered compensation to downwinders, mostly lump sum payments of $50,000 per person. It also covered uranium miners and certain test site workers. It wasn't everything, but it was something. For some families, it meant closure. For others, it felt hollow, as if a check could erase decades of pain. And for many, it came too late. It's from John Wayne, who filmed a Western movie near the Nevada test site in 1954. Nearly half the cast and crew later developed cancer. To qualify for compensation, victims had to meet strict criteria. They had to prove they lived in a certain county during a specific time period and had developed one of 19 eligible diseases. Thousands of claims were rejected. A woman who lost her father and 2 sisters was told she didn't qualify because her zip code was just outside the designated zone. Another man was denied because he developed cancer 5 years too late to meet the time frame. People called the process cold, rigid, and insulting. Still, survivors kept applying, not just for the money, but for the validation. Today, the Downwinder movement continues. Many of the original survivors have passed away, but their children and grandchildren are still fighting. Others are working to preserve the history, to make sure this story isn't forgotten. Because even now, many Americans have never heard of they've never heard of Shot Hood, never seen the maps, never read the memos that said exposure was acceptable if measured. But the survivors haven't forgotten, and they want the rest of us to remember too. There's one quote that often comes up in Downwinder. Wayne once said, "We were told it was safe, so we believed it." That belief, that trust, was at the center of everything. The people who lived downwind trusted their government, and that trust was betrayed. This chapter of history is not just about the damage that was done. It's about the people who refused to be erased, the people who turned grief into action, the ones who stood up and said, "You don't get to pretend we didn't exist." In our final chapter, we'll look at the bigger picture, why this still matters today, why documents are still sealed, and why this kind of thing could happen again. Chapter 5. We still don't know the full truth. You might think a story like this would end with answers, that after all the lawsuits, the reports, the confessions, everything would be clear. But that's not the case. Even now, decades later, we still don't know the full truth about what happened during the nuclear testing era in the United States. We don't know how many people were exposed, or how many deaths can truly be linked to fallout. We don't know how much the government still isn't saying, and that's not just speculation. It's a reality confirmed by researchers, journalists, and even former officials. Thousands of documents related to nuclear testing remain classified. Some have been redacted beyond recognition, entire pages blacked out. Others have disappeared entirely, marked as lost or destroyed. When survivors request their medical records or exposure data, they're often told, "We don't have it," or worse, That file no longer exists. Why would these records be missing? Some believe it's bureaucratic failure, messy filing systems, outdated archives. Others believe it's intentional to limit liability, to avoid embarrassment, or to protect the reputations of the people and agencies involved. Whatever the reason, the result is the same. We're left with questions. There's also the issue of underreported exposure. Recent studies suggest that radiation from tests like shothood may have traveled much farther than originally admitted. One investigation tracked fallout particles as far as upstate New York. If that's true, then millions more Americans may have been affected than previously thought. People who have no idea they were ever exposed. People who may still be living with the effects, without knowing the cause. And let us not forget, the downwinders we've talked about in this story represent only one group. There were also uranium miners, many of whom were Navajo, who worked without proper protection. Soldiers placed near the blast zones for training exercises. Factory workers who handled radioactive materials without being told the risks. Pacific Islanders whose homes were destroyed by offshore tests, some of whom still can't return. The ripple effects of this era stretch far and wide. So, why does this still matter? Because it's not just history. It's a warning, a reminder of what happens when secrecy is valued over safety, when science is twisted for military gain, when people in power believe the ends justify the means, no matter the cost, and perhaps, most chilling of all, this could happen again. Today, nuclear testing has largely stopped in the United States, but military experimentation hasn't. Across the country, the government continues to run secret programs involving chemical and biological agents, surveillance, technology, cyber weapons, artificial intelligence for combat. Most of these programs are classified. Many of them involve testing in real environments. And while the rules have improved since the 1950s, one thing hasn't changed. Ordinary people are still left in the dark. In 2003, a federal report quietly admitted that certain Cold War-era human experiments lacked proper consent or oversight. That same report called for more transparency moving forward, but more than 20 years later, that transparency is still hard to find. People living near military bases still report strange illnesses. Communities downwind of chemical plants still suffer unexplained cancer clusters. And every few years, a new declassified memo reveals something once thought unthinkable, just like shothood, just like the down. Maybe the most painful part of all this is knowing how avoidable it was. With better warnings, fewer lies, and more care, thousands of lives might have been saved. But instead, decisions were made in silence. Families were left to grieve without answers. And justice, if it came at all, came too late. We still don't know the full truth, and maybe we never will. But we can do something else. We can remember, we can listen, we can tell these stories so they don't disappear into the cracks of history again. And maybe, if enough people care, if enough people ask questions, if enough people refuse to look away, then the next time someone in power starts talking about acceptable risk, we'll be ready to say no. Thank you for staying with this story until the end. If it made you feel something, sadness, anger, curiosity, you're not alone. These aren't just distant events. They're part of a pattern we have to keep watching. So if you want more stories like this, ones they rarely teach in school, ones that deserve to be told, consider liking this video, subscribing to the channel, and sharing your thoughts in the comments. What do you think is still being hidden? What stories do you think need to be heard next? Until next time, stay aware, stay curious, and don't let the truth stay buried.